So now, what is happening after 25,000 years or 15,000 years of agriculture is that the processes that seemed eternal, the processes of tilling the fields, smelting metals, establishing markets, cutting deals, so forth and so on, have in our lifetimes emerged as self-limiting processes. You know, people think I'm a wild-eyed character because I predict some kind of transcendent transformation of the world within our lifetimes. But if you could sit in on the board meetings of the people who own the planet, they possess data moving across their desks every day which entirely support my contention that business as usual has been taken off the menu. You have only to propagate the curves of population growth, of HIV infection, of ozone depletion, of toxification of the oceans, so forth and so on. We all know the laundry list, to convince yourself that business as usual is no longer an option. There is no middle way. There is no Ozzie and Harriet third millennium scenario. The choices are either a hideous, nightmarish world, a Soylent Green kind of world, a world where people of privilege defend that privilege with tremendous establishments of armament and propaganda, and the rest of the world slips into poverty, starvation, desperation, and death. This is the kind of world that rationalists fear. And it's also the only kind of world that they can imagine because they are bankrupt of inspiration and ideas. And so the entire effort of the establishment has become one of holding down panic, keeping the ball in play, keeping ordinary people and ordinary populations quiescent through drugs which are not psychedelic, through forms of media which are not transcendental and inspiring, but which are narcoleptic and deadening. I won't name any names here. And this is the fiction that we live in, and this is why our situation feels so schizophrenic. And of course, as we go through this presidential election, the contradictions are heightened almost to the point of nausea, because what is under discussion is what manner of fine-tuning shall be applied to the social machinery in order to make it possible to hold together the illusion of business as usual. And the answer is there is no such fine-tuning. It's all finished. And instead, what is needed is a radical openness to new ideas of all sorts. And I believe that once this radical openness to new ideas is given respectability, the boundless creativity of the human mind will be tapped into and come to our aid. But we have to stop trying to preserve a status quo which has made us neurotic and self-defeating, admit that we have wandered long in the wilderness, and then begin to talk about what should be done about it. And I've always felt that the phobia which the powers that be feel toward the psychedelic experience is essentially a phobia of creativity, a phobia of dissolved boundaries, a phobia of honest discussion on a level playing field. All cultures are lies of some sort. We recently have lived through the very instructive example of the self-destruction of the socialist world. The contradictions became unbearable. The fiction of the glorious forward stride of socialist man toward a worker utopia eventually became insupportable in the face of the knock on the door in the middle of the night, the endless queues to buy food that wasn't there, so forth and so on. But before we lapse into some kind of smugness about this, we have to recognize that there are internal contradictions in our world as well. Adam Smith, in The Wealth of Nations, stated the general theory of capitalism. And the general theory of capitalism is access to cheap labor and extractable, inexpensive natural resources makes possible a manufacturing cycle in which finished objects can then be peddled to a core population that represents an advanced stage of civilization. Well, now this, however flawed this theory may have been, it worked as long as those two conditions were met: cheap labor and cheap extractable natural resources. This is now impossible. There is no cheap labor, and the cost of continued extraction of natural resources is the death of the planet. What we have to do is back away from our obsession with things. We can no longer define our worth through attachment to things. We have to create a psychology that reinforces inner worth. And, I hate to tell you, but strangely enough, this runs counter to democratic values. Because the notion behind democratic values is the person as physical atom in a social system. In other words, the notion of democracy is that we are all equal and can be used interchangeably in any social equation. This is the best we could do, the Greeks dreamed this up, until we back away from materialism. And materialism is not necessarily wedded or welded to democratic values. Democracy works in the kind of world we're living in only if it is severed from a capitalist consumer cycle. The other thing that we have to do is take responsibility for our population. And people are fond of just throwing up their hands and saying that the social momentum, the momentum toward world catastrophe is so great that nothing can be conceived of short of friendly visitors from Zeta Reticuli bailing us out that would lead to any kind of sane and rational world. But have you noticed that if every woman were to bear only one natural child, the population of the earth would fall by 50% in about 40 years without war, epidemic disease, or forced migration. Now, this is interesting. I don't advocate it. I simply think it's interesting that such a simple solution would have such an enormous impact on problems generally thought to be intractable. I discussed this idea with demographers, and they pointed out to me, and some of you have heard me say this before, but I think it's worth repeating, a woman on the Upper East Side of New York or in Malibu who has a child, that child will have between 800 and 1,000 times more negative impact on the environment of the earth than a child born to a woman in Bangladesh. Where do we preach birth control? Bangladesh. Why do we do this? Well, I'm not sure. This woman in Malibu or on the Upper East Side is a very likely candidate to be open to this message. She is, after all, college educated, media sophisticated, and feels, I think, generally a fair responsibility toward the problems that we all confront. Well, so then why aren't these kinds of ideas being tried? We could set up a set of social values where we could go to intelligent, educated women in high-tech industrial democracies and without any shuck or jive say, how would you like vastly increased leisure time, a vast increase in your disposable income, and the genuine status of hero in the fight to save the planet? Now, naturally, you can't do this if you have these fundamentalist yahoos running around raving about family values. But hopefully these people are going to be shipped back to whatever syphilitic, Bible-pounding rat hole they all came out of in the first place. Easy. So I was puzzled as I explored this idea, wondering not why it hasn't been tried, but why I've never heard it even discussed. And it came to me, finally, it's because nobody has figured out how you make a buck in a situation of retreating demographics like that. But notice what's going on. If you had a situation where the Earth's population was dropping by 50% in a 40-year period, it might be difficult for a corporation to make money in that kind of a situation by selling its products, but the wealth of the living would increase by 50% because you would every week be inheriting farms and country homes from cousins and aunts and uncles you didn't even know you had. So the wealth of individuals would increase, but the wealth of corporations would be under severe stress in that kind of a situation. Well, then that means that these corporations have become a kind of toxic force operating against the best interests of individuals.